Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to the March edition of our Cornerstone webinars. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as the Program Officer for National Leadership and Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our monthly webinar series that equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Tarek Adelazim, who serves as the Associate Director of National Technical Assistance here at Community Progress. He works on the development and execution of the organization's National Technical Assistance programs and also serves as a primary lead for New York State initiatives. Tarek is the author of numerous publications and essays on the growing National Land Bank movement and has delivered customized trainings for hundreds of land bank practitioners and land bank board members across the country. Prior to joining Community Progress in 2014, Tarek completed 8 years of public service in Binghamton, New York, as both the Deputy Mayor and the Director of Planning, Housing, and Community Development. Before turning it over to Tarek, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar host and all presenters. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. And with that, I turn it over to Tarek.
Thank you so much, Justin. I am assuming that, I do have power over the PowerPoint. Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you for that great introduction, and I'm so delighted to be here with, a very large group of interested attendees. And given I want to allow as much time as possible for a robust Q&A at the end of the session, I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to provide a quick outline of the presentation today. I'll do a quick introduction about Center for Community Progress, and make sure we have a common ground before we jump into some more of the details of the National Land Bank movement, discussing some best practices, common mistakes, and some of the innovators in the field, before then finishing up with some trends that we see in the field, and also a challenge I'm going to issue to those on the line and practitioners. So very quickly, I think most of you are familiar with our organization. The Center for Community Progress is the leading national resource in helping local communities first identify and then design solutions to the systemic causes of vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. We do this work really focusing on systems level changes. We bring to this work expertise in data management systems and practices at the local governmental level, as well as housing and building code enforcement systems, delinquent property tax enforcement systems, land bank, land banking, and reuse strategies. Now, we're not a large national organization. We're just under 20 staff members, but as I say, we punch way above our our weight class, and we provide the services through a range of program areas. Traditional fee-for-service, technical assistance. We also do our best to partner with national funders to provide a lot of communities with scholarship opportunities for technical assistance, recognizing that there really is, most of the communities we work with are already operating under constrained resources and constrained fiscal environments. But we do work through education and training, as well as policy and research. So just to give you an example, a snapshot in 2017, our team has fielded hundreds of technical assistance inquiries, many led to dozens of engagements at the local, county, regional level. And we, through our work, supported policy, legislative, programmatic change in dozens of communities. That's both at the local and the state level. Through our education, we've reached almost 4,500 individuals in 2017, and through our publications, distributed thousands to support this growing field. Now, our flagship event for our educational work is the Reclaiming National Vacant Properties Conference, and I highly encourage folks to consider attending, as I could take off my CCP hat and put on my former practitioner hat. I will say, attending conferences for 8 years, this was the most substantive, practical and inspiring, action-oriented conference that I'd ever attended, and I'm proud to say it remains that way. We will be in Atlanta on October 2nd through the 4th, and again, they can find plenty more information about that at our website. One last thing, just before we go through this work, we really do focus on racial justice and equity. All of our staff members are former practitioners or policy makers that come to this work not only with a passion to help build inclusive and resilient communities, but really to make sure that we are prioritizing racial justice and equity, both as foundational principles of the work and as desired outcomes. So establishing common ground, I'm going to start somewhere where probably folks didn't expect me to, and that is talking very briefly about delinquent property tax enforcement systems. I hope it will become clear through the webinar why I started here. I will give a hint that the primary source of property acquisitions for land banks across the country is through the tax foreclosure process. If I had to estimate, I'd probably say it's 90 to 95% of all of the properties that come into land banks come in through this pipeline of delinquent property tax enforcement. So it's incredibly important to understand both this system by itself and then how it's integrated to land banks. So if we could start first, if we have property taxes that are delinquent, there are multiple ways that local communities can deal with that. One pathway is that they sell the debt. In other words, they're not selling the property. What they're doing is going to an investor field or one firm and selling all of the tax liens that are due and delinquent. And they sell them either in bulk or individually. Basically, it's a way to get cash up front for the municipality to run its business, but it comes with a heavy cost, and that is it transfers the incredible power of foreclosure, which can bring a delinquent property, particularly a vacant and abandoned delinquent property, into public ownership. It transfers that power to investors. These investors can be international, out of state, who really have no interest or stake in the future and vitality of the neighborhood, but are really participating in a profit venture, hoping to secure 10, 12, 18% return. We are not big fans of this process, as you might imagine. Now, if we look at the other alternative, is that municipalities will basically hold on to the debt, and state laws are varied all across the country in determining that process. But to very broadly speaking, let's say it's 2-3 years of property is delinquent, then the municipality can pursue judicial in rem foreclosure. It's basically going to the courts, providing constitutional notice to all of the parties and the parties on the deed, saying you have a certain amount of period to reclaim your property, pay this debt. If not, it will come into ownership of the municipality, and then we can dispose of this property. And oftentimes, most municipalities that pursue judicial in rem foreclosure will use the auction process. Now, if that's common in your community, you recognize that this really does attract a different set of investors. In many weak communities, legacy cities, you see sometimes the same landlords that are causing problems in other neighborhoods, what we often call milkers, that are going to the auction, picking up these properties for $10,000, $15,000 cash, draining them of whatever remaining equity with little interest in the quality of the housing, and then dumping that property back to the municipality in worse shape than it is. This is not a process that determines that can guarantee predictable outcomes, nor is it a process where you can really guarantee that the person you're selling to is responsible but also has a vision or use idea for that project that is consistent with community priorities. That's really where land banks kind of originated. There was this sense that we want a more predictable process when these tax foreclosed properties do come into public ownership. We want to be able to vet the owners. We want more responsible investors. We want to prioritize homeowners. We don't want them competing with out-of-state investors. And so you can see there are two ways, both in-house land banking, where municipalities can basically build the capacity in-house to manage and steward those properties back to productive use. But that does still come with restrictions on disposition policies. Many governments are a bit more restricted in how they can dispose of those. The land bank is a legal entity that's literally designed to provide communities flexibility and to prioritize the outcome over the highest bid. We're going to unpack that later in the webinar, but it's very important that I thought we started with this system since it plays such an integral role of land bank's effectiveness around the country. So what really is a land bank? Well, a land bank is a public authority or nonprofit, focuses on the conversion of vacant, abandoned, tax delinquent, foreclosed, deteriorated properties into productive use. Now, it literally does this through the conferment of special powers, and the next slide will touch on that. But just to give you a broad snapshot nationally, there are about over 170 land banks nationwide, and it seems like there are more coming on, every month across the country. The overwhelming majority have been established in the last 10, 11 years, since 2008 in the Great Recession. The overwhelming majority of them exist pursuant to comprehensive state enabling legislation. And again, I'll make that clear in the next slide. This is not just a paper entity or nonprofit that anyone can start. It is literally a legal entity that has been endowed special powers to pursue its mission of transforming vacant, abandoned, deteriorated properties into assets for neighbors and neighborhoods. We see the largest concentration of land banks in Michigan, Ohio, New York, and Georgia, but they are far west, I believe, is Omaha, Nebraska, in Texas, and many other states that one wouldn't think is the traditional legacy cities where land banks originally emerged. So some key powers of land banks. As I say, they're only as powerful as the statutes that created them. And typically, we help states create enabling legislation. I believe we've helped craft and educate officials about the land bank legislation in more than a dozen states. Again, the majority of them since 2008. But some of the key powers that we work with the local communities and state officials to consider is one, will the land bank have the power to acquire tax foreclosed property cost effectively? So I'll give you a couple examples. In many states, the legislation allows for a land bank what's called a priority bid. So if a government does continue that tax foreclosure process where they end up auctioning off the actual properties, a land bank can step in right away, pay the minimum bid that's owed on that property to the municipalities, all the liens and back taxes, and basically have priority over all other investors. Even if investors were to offer higher bids, the land bank is given special power to jump in. It's basically a way of the state and local government saying, we want to prioritize this entity that is going to serve as a public steward of these properties, consistent with community priorities, over investors who we're not quite sure if they're going to be responsible or pursue outcomes that we deem most appropriate. There's also legislation in Georgia where it's even better, where they offer credit bid. So a land bank has the power under some circumstances to basically take the property without any cash payment, because there's a recognition that these properties are underwater, they're distressed, they're deteriorated. There's going to need to be some investment to get them back to productive use, and that's seen as a concession, and so there's no need for a cash payment. Land banks also are granted the ability to extinguish liens and clear title in some states. The whole purpose of this is to make sure that we remove the legal and financial barriers that basically are keeping a lot of these troubled properties stuck and in decline. So making sure that at the end of the process, either the judicial and rem foreclosure process or that the land bank itself has the power to end up with clear title so you can actually attract home buyers and investors into that property. Almost everywhere we see land banks have the ability to hold property tax exempt. We often work with states to think about different funding mechanisms in that land bank legislation that allow them to generate and collect revenue. And we also work with them on making sure that they have extremely flexible disposition decisions. Again, remember, most local governments have to issue competitive RFPs, rightfully so, but they often have to sell to the highest bid. In this case, land banks are not bound by those restrictions, and they're really driven by the best outcome. And they decide those disposition decisions and the priorities with the community to ensure that the inventory they have is consistently going to support community goals. So when is land banking the right tool? I can tell you that we get more and more calls every day, whereas if any community is facing a housing challenge, and certainly this is a national crisis, the first thing that pops into their head is we need a land bank. Well, I'm going to talk about some instances where that might not be the case, but we really encourage communities to first understand what is the problem in your community. What is the nature of the inventory that's driving some of these challenges? Common characteristics of communities that have moved forward with land banks is that they've experienced pretty steady and sometimes very significant population loss. Obviously, that creates an imbalance in the housing market, and thus there are high rates of vacant and abandoned properties. In the same cities we see, which is complementary, weak economic conditions, properties that are stuck with little market value, that investors see little opportunity to invest when the property itself might not be worth what was invested at the end. We see inefficient and inequitable tax foreclosure code lien enforcement systems. You know, we will encourage communities to think about making those systems more effective and equitable before considering land banks, but land bank might be a right tool to partner with some of those reforms in the right conditions. And then I'll jump to the last one, is sudden shocks. We've seen land banks deployed both from human-generated concerns and economic-generated, or natural events, such as the Great Recession we saw and Hurricane Katrina, where entire neighborhoods were devastated. And there's just a huge uptick of vacant and abandoned properties. Well, a land bank can serve as the right tool to return those properties to productive use, but to do it in a manner that really centers equity, both as a foundational principle and a desired outcome. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of where it might not work. You know, where wouldn't the land bank might not be a viable solution? Well, let's look to one community, Las Vegas, Nevada, and we've done some technical assistance work with that community. If you look at this map, it's a map of the mortgage foreclosures. This was back in 2010. But you can imagine if you were a legislator in Las Vegas, you might have a lot of residents and constituents calling you saying, there are vacant properties all over our neighborhood. Well, this is again where we encourage communities to make sure you understand your inventory. Because if the overwhelming majority of these are mortgage foreclosures, or the overwhelming majority of vacant properties in Las Vegas were mortgage foreclosures, where they're just left vacant during a lengthy foreclosure process, or they were actually foreclosed upon, and this did happen, many banks kind of kept this REO inventory off MLS as kind of a shadow inventory because they were waiting for the market to return and strengthen before they sold these assets. A land bank really wouldn't do much good here. As we talked before, as the primary source of acquisition for land banks is the tax foreclosure process. Unless those banks are willing to give up those properties, there's really no way a land bank can access that vacancy. So thinking about different ways that you might be able to address that might seem more appropriate in Las Vegas. It doesn't mean a land bank couldn't help in the long run, but it's just that better understanding your inventory will point you to the right solutions. A second place is in Florida, and we've done quite a bit of work in Florida, Fort Myers, Jacksonville, Miami, Miami Gardens, either technical assistance or having conversations, and the common response is, we really could use a land bank. Well, state law in Florida mandates that all local jurisdictions sell tax liens to investors. So go back to that first slide, basically it eliminated that pipeline of tax foreclosed properties that a land bank could connect to. Again, in Florida, they're prioritizing the investors over predictable outcomes and local government's ability to deploy this tool. So I just wanted you to see this is where we bring a comprehensive approach to helping communities understand the systemic causes the legal systems, and potential tools. You really need to understand, do a data-driven approach, and you also need to know the state laws and local laws that could either challenge or serve as a barrier or an opportunity for the right solutions. So how are land banks funded? This is when we did a survey a few years back about land banks challenges, funding was the #1 concern, and it's not surprising. I mean, we're dealing with basically a broken inventory that has been stuck in decline, discarded by the market. These are going to require a substantial amount of investments in order to return them to productive use, and a lot of creative interventions. So where are land banks getting their funding? Typically from local governmental support. There are a lot of cities and county governments that provide direct allocations every year to the land banks to support operations. There's been an incredible number of grant programs at the state and the federal program that have supported some of the largest stabilization programs we've seen in decades, particularly through the hardest hit funds. We've seen a lot of New York Attorney General's office and other Attorney General's office take some of the settlement dollars and drive them towards the fledgling land bank movements in their states to drive some really powerful incomes. But we also see it from foundations playing a key role in land banks activities. And some of these other ones that we might have thought at the beginning, maybe 5-10 years ago, that could have been a very significant source of funding, what's called tax recapture. Basically, this means that any property that comes into a land bank, and this is a provision in state enabling legislation, that after they sell it and get it back to productive use for 5 years, they have the ability and authority to collect 50% of the property taxes. It's basically a way to say thank you for turning this property from a cost driver to the municipalities to now a revenue generator. But that really hasn't been a substantial source of funding for land banks. And it's clear that the best solution is to have a recurring funding source, and the best in the field, we'll talk about in a bit, it was done at the state level in Ohio. Now, before we talk about some of the best practices in the field, I did want to just very quickly distinguish between a couple entities that we receive a lot of questions about. What is the difference between a land bank and a redevelopment agency or community land trust? Well, if you think about a redevelopment agency, the one big image that comes to my head is a large economic development project, right? I mean, they're really focusing on catalyzing economic development in certain neighborhoods. A land bank's mission is just as much about revitalization as it is stabilization. It's going in and eliminating that hazardous property. It's taking demolition as a major programmatic goal. So, you know, land banks are often going to be seen more as helping neighborhoods stabilize and revitalize. Redevelopment agencies still focused on large economic development projects. One key difference is acquisition powers. Redevelopment agencies have power of eminent domain. Through our work, we have advocated very strongly that land banks do not have that power. And none of the state enabling legislations that we've helped pass include that, because as we know, there's a long history of government or government agencies coming into distressed neighborhoods, particularly communities of color, acquiring property that have led to some incredibly egregious and inequitable outcomes. We did not want the land bank to even be perceived as possibly repeating that path, so removed eminent domain from its kind of suite of tools and powers. With land banks and community land trusts, definitely complementary, but distinct. First off is the mission and the origin stories. I mean, I think I would encourage folks to check out one of the origin stories of what is widely considered the first community land trust in the country in Albany, Georgia. It will be celebrating its 50th year anniversary, which will also be commemorated at the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference in Atlanta. It really emerged out of the civil rights movement and a way to provide land, recognizing land as a power for liberation, empowerment to black farmers. So completely different origin story, and since then has really worked in some of the hotter markets to preserve permanent, affordable housing. And that's the focus of Community Land Trust, is being able to permanently control, community control of land for community good. It's often permanent affordable housing. Land banks, as we've discussed, the mission is really not to own property in perpetuity. It's to serve as a conduit and a way to transfer distressed properties to assets to neighbors and neighborhoods. That's the key difference there in the ownership. One is temporary, one is more permanent. We have done some articles with our national partner, Grounded Solutions Network, on land bank and community land trusts, both their differences, but where there's incredible opportunity to partner. We've also done some work, for instance, in Albany, New York recently, piloting opportunities between the Albany County Land Bank and Albany Community Land Trust. All those resources are available on our website if you'd like to learn more. It's definitely an emerging area of this field of work that we're really excited to help cultivate. So if we jump now to a national scan, just some key elements of land banking that I think we've touched on a bit, right? It is an alternative to the speculative auction, generates more predictable outcomes, consistent with community needs. We emphasize that, look, no matter how much you try to sell self-sufficiency, it's always going to need some level of support, cash or in kind, that's proportional to the scope and scale that the land bank is expected to help resolve. We've mentioned on the right side, it's connected to tax foreclosure process. It really needs to be driven by data. It needs to be aligned with other blight strategies. This land bank is not a silver bullet. It should just be seen as one tool that you can integrate into a comprehensive suite of strategies, programs, policies, operational changes, partnerships that is going to help turn the needle in your community. Finally, I just want to emphasize, you know, as much as we try to design and kind of code the DNA of land banks to emphasize community engagement, that is entirely up to local practice. But we really emphasize the importance of working particularly with those residents who are most impacted by vacancy and abandonment. And then in order to maintain that strong level of trust and partnership, all of your transactions, they should be driven by policy, they should be transparent and accountable. A lot of the state enabling legislation that we help pass, we try to write in some certain reporting requirements that uphold that commitment to transparency and accountability. So let's talk about, we're going to go through 5 common mistakes that we've seen in the field of land banks, and there may be some places that have avoided them and handled them well. You know, again, I sound like a broken record, but it is sometimes a lack of data and a clarity on the problem. We could see folks launching a land bank or contemplating a land bank when in fact that is not the appropriate tool. So it's really understanding, you know, your parcel data and your market data. In local governments, we have an incredible history of being siloed with political turfs and political egos. And data is like seen as power. We help communities try to unlock that siloed approach and recognize that the more you integrate your parcel data, utility shutoffs, nuisance and police calls, where there's zombie mortgages, delinquency in property taxes, housing code violations, not only are you better to react to the challenges in the neighborhood by understanding your inventory, but you are in a better position to actually be proactive and predict where some of your interventions can eliminate a problem before it becomes a significant one. So one of the leaders in the field is Cuyahoga County Land Bank in Ohio. They have, this is a partnership with local university and many other partners, the county and such, where they've developed an incredibly expansive data system called NeoCanDo, and they actually use it with a property profile system. This integrates, I would not be surprised if it is 50 to 100 different data sets that really help paint a picture both of where parcels are, or problem parcels are, and trends in the neighborhood. So the Cuyahoga County Land Bank works with the county treasurer and the GIS representatives to really identify where they're going to pull properties from and push them forward to foreclosure, where they're going to do demolitions, where they're going to invest in green maintenance treatments, green treatments. having this extensive database has just made their interventions far more strategic and impactful. Common mistake number 2 is just, let's launch a land bank and start tackling vacant properties. Sometimes the problem and the scope and scale is very large. So you really need to have a conversation about what it is you're going to prioritize. And that shouldn't be a board of elected officials. It should be working in tandem with the community, ensuring that those voices, again, that are in the neighborhoods most impacted by vacancy and abandonment help establish goals and then align their strategies accordingly. Now, one land bank in Albany, New York, Albany County Land Bank. The reason why we wanted to just highlight this is they do an incredible job through their website and through their community engagement to manage expectations and to be very transparent. They're always evaluating their program based on community feedback. If you go to their website, there is absolutely no secret to the activities, to meetings, to operations, to investments. I mean, it's a really impressive, I think, example of how committing time to the website and social media can go a long way towards communicating and building that trust with the community you serve. Probably one of the biggest mistakes is that when land banks are launched, and I understand this as a former public servant and somebody who you have to play those political chess games sometimes, but we might too often overplay this card that, yeah, let's create a land bank and within 2 years it will be self-financing. That is rarely ever seen in the field. And again, it's because of the challenges that the land bank has been designed to help address. These are properties stuck in decline, underwater, in distressed neighborhoods, properties that have been abandoned for years. Demolition is an intervention of last resort, but there's no question that demolition will be part of a strategy to stabilize and revitalize neighborhoods. Those are all costly interventions with very little opportunity for cash return, but the social, economic, environmental return can be profound. So we really try to emphasize with communities, do not overplay this card. It doesn't happen in the field. You're going to need to figure out a way to finance this work. The other thing we do in the context of this conversation is help communities understand that you're already spending an incredible amount of money on the problem as it is. We've done cost of blight studies with Toledo and Atlanta. There are other communities that have done a tremendous job quantifying, whether that's direct service calls to police, fire, code enforcement, whether it's the impact on assessments and then taxes that can be generated and collected by municipality. The greatest cost is doing nothing. And so yes, this work is going to be capital intensive, but the community should think about shifting resources from reacting to a problem to addressing it proactively through a land bank and other comprehensive approaches. When we did this survey of the national field, the only land banks that did not identify funding as a problem were all from Ohio. And it wasn't surprising. When Ohio passed its statewide land bank enabling legislation in 2009, they included in there the first of its kind, which was basically a provision that ensured recurring funding for all land banks. Basically, it's called the Delinquent Tax Assessment Collection. It was a way for counties, and land banks can only be created at the counties in Ohio because that's where taxes are collected at the county level, that they can take 5% of all of the delinquent fees and fines from delinquent taxes and move that over to a land bank, basically revitalization fund. So each county can dedicate 5% of their delinquent fines and fees towards land bank interventions. To give you a sense of what that means, in Cuyahoga County, again a leader in the field, not surprisingly, they receive about $7 million a year through this. Basically, it ensures that those professionals are thinking strategically and working with their partners to create innovative solutions instead of spending half of their time chasing the next grant dollar. This is obviously a national model in the field. Hasn't been replicated yet at the state level, but we are hoping that other places fingers crossed, in New York State in the next couple of years will join suit with Ohio and figure out a statewide recurring funding solution. So I touched on this earlier in regards to eminent domain. We often see really inauthentic engagement with communities. We see a commitment to it, but in practice, land banks, either they're committed and have a hard time making it genuine, or they just ignore it. And we will always emphasize and challenge constructively our partners is that you really need to take this seriously, right? As I mentioned before, government coming in to acquire property, right, in neighborhoods that felt neglected, it introduces some real anxiety and legitimate concerns. Those are historically based, they're justified, and the best way to avoid those is through authentic community engagement in which you're prioritizing their voices and their needs over others. In Ohio, again, Lucas County Land Bank, they actually have a dedicated full-time staff member, the Director of Community Engagement. And that is this individual's sole purpose, is to serve as a liaison to all the neighbors and community groups. It's to always be present at these meetings and to really kind of build. I mean, this work is a lot about relationship building. We're not going to fix this problem overnight. It's going to require managing expectations, maintaining trust after we build it, and that only comes through a consistent cultivation of real engagement. And it's not surprising, again, that a land bank from the state that provides recurring funding has made a very strategic and wise and responsible investment in this activity. Going it alone, the sense that land banks can solve it. All it needs is a sharp board and board members, and they're going to be able to address the problems. And that's silly. That is a big myth. You can't do this work without strategic partnerships, without cross-sector collaborations. And what we often see in the field is that where collaborations exist, they serve as the foundation for even more innovative partnerships that wouldn't have been thought of just years prior. So it is another thing that needs constant requirement and investment by a land bank. And if you think about it, some land banks try to do too much. They're like, okay, we own the property, we're going to manage it, we're going to steward it, we're going to redevelop it, we're going to own it, we're going to sell it, we're going to rent it. Don't assume that you have to play all these roles, right? There are already community partners that have expertise in this work, and your key as a conduit and as a public steward accountable to the community is to really serve that liaison between the tax foreclosure process, the government, and the community. How are we going to use these and transform these assets to serve neighbors and neighborhoods? As you can see on the right, I mean, the partnerships are only limited by the imagination. We know that there are many reuses to vacant land. It's not just infill affordable housing. It could be dealing with climate change concerns, green stormwater infrastructure. It could be addressing food security and building an urban agricultural movement. It can be dealing with healthy built environments by expanding access to green space. It can be helping build wealth by selling side lots to existing homeowners. So these are all need to be done through the cultivation of partners. One great example is in Macon-Bibb County Land Bank, where this took about 10 years of work, but through a deep, diverse, and inclusive coalition that kept at it for nearly a decade, saw some pretty massive transformations in a historic African-American neighborhood in Macon called Beals Hill. And you can see a list of all those partners there: institutional partners, anchor partners, governmental partners at all levels, nonprofits, community groups, really came together, and some of the quantitative outcomes, changing home ownership rates, the change in property values was just stunning. And as a former director of planning, housing, and community development, those were outcomes I would have taken any day. But this, again, is the slow work that needs to be done, and it needs to be done genuinely and collaboratively. Now, moving forward, what's next for land banking? You know, as we mentioned, addressing this financial problem, we're hoping to support land banks and land bank statewide networks to convince state legislators to think about dedicated funding streams, or there might be local mechanisms in order to accomplish that. Given the massive demolition campaigns that have been carried out through the hardest hit funds, which was part I think about 2010 it was, particularly in Michigan and Ohio, we see more and more communities calling us now about less vacant properties and what do we do with these massive inventories of vacant land. I would say that Detroit is really leading the field in thinking creatively about how to see this as a permanent asset that can serve neighbors and neighborhoods. Moving from the fringe to center of community development. You know, land banks are seen just as kind of this almost anomaly, just this new tool, this new kid on the block, but as they develop these deeper partnerships, as they embrace their role as a public steward of land, you're really finding them moving to the center of some of the most innovative and equitable community development we're seeing out in the field, and it's incredibly inspiring to see that work happen. Preserving affordability and supporting inclusive communities. As I mentioned, you know, seeing greater connections between land banks and community land trusts. Community land trusts, which had typically had challenges accessing properties, well, land banks are then a very strategic partner to work with. And we're seeing more and more of that interest, not just in Albany, but in places like Houston and Washington and such. So we're supporting that effort, and we're excited about what that means. And then obviously is making sure that the research field does its job evaluating impacts and outcomes. We're starting to see more research on what were the impacts of large-scale demolitions to vacant properties. We're seeing very interesting research on crime related to vacant properties and improved health outcomes from greening vacant land. So as that work continues, I think it makes a stronger case for land banks and advocates and partners to go to the states to justify continued funding. So here's my little soapbox speech to finish before we get into the questions and answer sessions. You know, my challenge to the field is that if we think about some of the key challenges that all of our communities are facing across this country, I think this map probably triggers a lot of folks thinking about, you know, The Color of Law, Rothstein's book, is we still have incredibly segregated cities. And this is a historical, incredibly unjust policies, but our communities are still highly segregated. If you think about that strong connection to systemic poverty, which we see all across the country, not just in legacy cities, but all across the country, systemic levels of poverty. And we also see a wealth gap that has grown tremendously and that we know is racialized. When the median household wealth for a white household is $140,000, and the median household wealth for black household is $13,000 or $14,000. We have to recognize that this is not just a gap between households; it's a gap that is also racialized. If we look also, then there's another connection is to housing. We know that housing is literally becoming a national conversation, is largely figuring into even federal races. Every community is struggling, not just with housing affordability, but thanks to the great research and the conversation started by Matt Desmond, that housing quality at the low end of the private rental market is a major concern. How do we ensure that everybody has a right, has access to affordable, decent, healthy housing? And finally, the climate change. Right? There's no question that many communities are struggling with the impacts of climate change already and are very concerned about the future impact. Now, there are many connections here, but I'll tell you there's one big one, and that's land. Who has access to it? Who owns it? Who gets to choose the use? Who are we serving? Right? Whose interests are we prioritizing when we talk about land? So I would say that this is my challenge to the field, is that for all those who are either practitioners or thinking about getting into land bank and interested, is it really just to rebuild what we had in the past? Is it just to serve economic and political systems that might have contributed to some of the inequities that we're faced with? If that's the case, I'd say we all ought to close up shop and go home. I think the work really needs to be in recognizing that through this work we have a chance to address some of these major crises in rebuilding our community, again with a focus and on racial equity and justice as a foundational principle and a desired outcome. So that sound is me getting off my soapbox, and I will now turn to the close. We have plenty of additional resources on the website. You'll find some of the publications that we've produced that have served as seminal resources for the field. Also, we maintain a land bank information headquarters page at the website that includes a lot of information and an interactive map of where land banks are. So I'm going to try to tackle some of these questions here. There have been a lot coming in. If you just give me a second here. Okay, why aren't there land banks further west? That's a great question. I would say it's largely just because of the legacy cities and that we see a lot of the post-industrial challenges that emerged in the New England and the Northeast. But since the Great Recession, we certainly see more and more communities impacted by vacant, abandoned, distressed properties, and that interest is certainly growing. Hey, Justin, is there a way to expand the question panel? I apologize, folks, but all I can see is like 2 lines right now. Let's see if I can do. Yeah.
What you may want to do is you can minimize the other one. So if you have the participants in the chat open, like just minimize those, and it should make, or you can even exit out of them, and it should make.
I got it.
Yeah.
All right. What role does the private industry play in land banking blight vacancy work? I would say a very important role. I don't think anyone is really left out of this equation. The question is the private industry going to come in and be a supportive partner through the priorities of the land bank? And if they are, then great. If there's folks in the private industry like slumlords or irresponsible investors or predatory lending that wants to play a role, I'd say you probably want to close the door on them, right? So define what your priorities are, what your goals are, and then find those who are willing to commit to that shared goal. How do land banks and opportunity zones interact? That is something that I think is an emerging discussion, and I think there is a lot of, I would say in the field where folks are committed to equitable community development, there's a lot of apprehension about opportunity zones at this point. Some great research showing that the majority of zones designated are already in neighborhoods that are experiencing some level of gentrification as defined by increasing home values over a 5-year period or such. So we're just not sure how that's going to play out. But certainly we have encouraged some land banks here in New York, for example, to start thinking about the role that they can play. Don't wait for investors to come to you. Be proactive, and again, put together projects that uphold your values, that are consistent with your community needs, and then pitch that project to the field of investors through this opportunity and with the benefits of the opportunity zone. So I know there's more and more, and there's some great leaders in the field, Enterprise Lisk and others, that are taking some leadership roles in helping communities develop equitable frameworks for opportunity zones. And I would say as land banks holding a large inventory of properties likely in opportunity zones, that they need to be engaged in those conversations and be very thoughtful about the projects that they enter into or that they put forward. So there's some questions that came in a bit earlier in the webinar that I hope I answered about best practices for funding. There's a question, top 5 land banks by size of assets. I would encourage you to check out the land bank information headquarters. And we did a national scan back in 2014, and although things have changed, there's no question that in Michigan, the 2 of the largest would be the Detroit Land Bank and Flint, the Genesee County Land Bank. In Ohio, probably Cuyahoga County Land Bank. Toledo, the Lucas County Land Bank is very active. In New York, the 2 largest landholders are the Syracuse Land Bank and the Albany Land Bank. So land banks come in all shapes and sizes. They're determined by local policy decisions, how they're funded. So I would start there if you're interested, or if you wanted to reach out some more to me personally, I'd be happy to share some additional insights particular to your question. So there's this question, when you spoke about in-kind support, what did I mean? By that I meant that either the county or the city that created the land bank provides staff to commit time to managing the land bank activities. So that's in-kind support. For instance, let's say the lawyers assist with legal services, in-kind support. There have been some land banks that have worked with their code enforcement offices to provide some inspections of properties that they pull into the inventory after the foreclosure process, right? So the city isn't charging them for that. They're providing that support in kind. There are a lot of small land banks that work in rural counties where there is no dedicated staff, but it's just the county and the city staff that run this as kind of an additional program. How many land banks have a full-time director? I don't have an answer to that, but certainly where you are not a rural land bank and just going to tackle a couple properties a year, it seems that the pattern is if you have dedicated staff member, a dedicated director, you're able to accomplish a lot more. The work that we talked about is building cross-sector collaborations, maintaining engagement with the community, communications. It really does need dedicated staff. I think many of us know, whether through other nonprofit work, when you have that dedicated staff, it just makes a huge difference in the activities you can do. Where can I learn more about Ohio's DTAC? There's some great resources online. You can go to, I think it's the Thriving Community Institute. Google that. You'll find a lot of what they basically serve as a resource to a lot of the Ohio land banks. They have a lot of land bank publications, maps, resources, and I believe that there's some deeper information about Ohio's DTAC there. Wow, you all are asking some great questions, and a lot of them. Should residents be able to purchase vacant land in their neighborhood or city without owning property adjacent to property? It's a great question. And I'd point you to Albany County Land Bank. They have now run 2 versions of the same program. It's basically a lot for a little is the program called, where they're selling vacant lots for nominal fee. The first year, they required that only those who owned the property immediately adjacent would be eligible purchasers. They've now changed that so that anybody on the block, even a renter, could consider purchasing. So you might want to reach out to them to learn, to hear about the lessons they learned, and maybe even some ongoing challenges or insights from their version 2 model. So maybe one more question here, and then I'll turn it back over to Justin to finish. Okay. Some of these are very specific, and so I didn't want to take up the last time. Okay, I think we're going to stop there because a lot of these are specific. I did see some logistical concerns, and that is that, yes, the PowerPoint slide will be shared. If I understand correctly, Justin, all the attendees will receive an email with the PowerPoint with the recording of the webinar. Yeah. And I am going to do my best to answer as many of these questions as possible. So for those whose questions I didn't get to, I do want to apologize, but I really am going to make my best effort to answer all of them. And we then will include that as a PDF. I just want to say, please feel free to reach out at any time to me directly. If you had a very pressing problem or question that I wasn't able to get to, I'd be happy to spend some time with you, either via email or over the phone. So thank you all. I hope you found this informational and also inspiring. Thank you for the work you do in the communities across the country.
All right, that was great. Thank you, Tarek. And just to confirm, yes, we will be sending out an email in the days following today's webinar with both the presentation and the recording from today's session. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon, and we hope that you will join us on April 25th for our next Cornerstone webinar. Please visit our website for more information on this and other upcoming webinars, and have a great afternoon.